Hey, CSCA members. My name is Elliot Richardson. I am one of the board of director members as well as a co-chair for the education committee. Today, we're going to be sitting down to chat with Owen MacWilliams, and we're going to be talking today a bit about coaching the multi-sport youth athlete. For those of you who haven't had a chance to learn or meet Owen in person, I'll give him a few minutes here just to go over his story, his background, and why he feels he has something to add to this conversation.
Thanks, Elliot. Just a quick background, I guess. Right now, currently, I'm the assistant sport performance coach at St. FX University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. In the past, previously, I worked at Andrews Hockey Growth Programs, being a director at Andrews Sport Conditioning. That involved a lot of youth training from ages 5 right up until high school. During my time at Andrews, it was mostly just hockey. Eventually, we started working with numerous sport and multi-sport athletes. And whenever we did start working with multi-sport athletes, is where I gained the experience of working with that population that has a lot on their plate throughout the year.
So when it comes to, working with the youth population, what are some of your principles, your core guiding principles, systems that you believe by and you found to be successful and are backed up by the literature?
Well, right off the hop from Jeremy first, looking at the long-term athlete development plan that Canada has posted through Canadian Sport, using fundamentals for ages 6 till 10 roughly, and then using the learn to train model from 9 till puberty or peak height velocity for high school kids. Our principles really started with the person, let alone the actual training. So when they first came into the door, it's like welcome mat, right? For these kids, they're new to it. So it was more of a being enjoyment when they walk in the door. There's that person with the face that they could see, and it was happy to see them. So our principles started off with that, and then kind of bridged into the engagement piece when they do come into a session, the creativity during the session, after kids actually applying things to sport, the enjoyment again of the session and having fun while they're there with the coach, and then teaching while they're there so they know why they're doing things. Kids are curious. People should explain what they're doing with them and why they're doing it. And then also at the end of the day is develop a stronger athlete.
So it sounds like it's not even so much the science initially, it's more the art, it's more the personality, it's more everything else. You talked about engagement, getting engaged with the kid, because for them this is something that's not their sport, it's not their primary thing that they love to do, but there is benefit for it. And then being creative, and then just making them have fun, because if they're having fun, then they're more likely to buy into the program you're providing. It isn't until it sounded like point 4, like then it's developing strength slowly and surely, and just being a very good teacher. So it sounds like it's more about the environment with that. And there are multiple environments. These youth sport athletes are playing sports, but they're also engaged in sport at school as well too. Or but what are some of the challenges maybe of for these youth athletes that are working with sport coaches at that level and trying to make sure that they're getting the ABCs of physical literacy and long-term athlete development?
Well, just from a personal experience, and some literature will back it up as well, is just saying that these coaches are very passionate. They're usually parents, or typically parents that have a skill set in another field or in strength conditioning. It doesn't truly matter. They're there to help the kids have fun at the sport and be social in a group. The one thing that it could actually translate a little better will be them just understanding the full weekly schedule of those athletes and understanding, okay, well, if it's the springtime, there's always spring hockey that's coming up, there's baseball, and those two schedules overlap. Meanwhile, the kid has already been into a scenario of hockey for 6 to 8 months. And the sport coach maybe just not be cognitive of that time and saying that we don't need to do spring hockey or vice versa, we don't need to start baseball. And then at the end of the day, those sport coaches help with cultivating an environment in that strength conditioning facility, especially with the environment we had. As such, where it's a time to learn, practice motor skills, improve the physical fitness, and then eventually focus on attributes like cooperation, sportsmanship, all of that stuff entitled into one. So I think they do a really good job of doing that and volunteering their time. It's just really tough to do the other things with such a limited amount of time with these kids.
And probably some expertise as well too, as you said. Like a
Absolutely.
lot of these parents that are working with our youth athletes that are setting the foundation for the rest of their lives may not have a background in kinesiology or background strength and conditioning, and are looking at their sport that they're working with those kids in isolation of everything else, as opposed to in combination with, and not understanding the whole full load, because there's also other things going on with these kids as well too. Like they might be involved in PE, and that might be helping, or it might not be delivering enough. What's the current status of PE as a general blanket statement across the country right now?
Yeah, it seemed from what is resourced to people outside of the curriculum for the physical education for Canada, it seems every province is different, and the rankings may fluctuate every year depending on one province may be first or second or third the year after. But right now, in Canada, the Canadian public schools, it's roughly 150 minutes a week. So now looking at that 150 minutes, that's not including the classroom time that they do dedicate because they have to do so much in their curriculum. And on top of that, that's not reflection period once they've done an activity and basically reflecting and doing module or any type of classroom work with that. And then on top of that, you have the instruction, the setup. That all takes time, including that 150 minutes. So if a person just looked at that objectively and said, okay, well, 150 minutes, cut that in half. So essentially it's about 75 minutes a week. Where I'm at in Prince Edward Island right now, it's 60 to 90 minutes a week for middle school age kids. Now that depends on the school district, but right now that's the average out of all three. So if you look at 60 to 90 minutes, that truly doesn't get a youth athlete or set them up for any success in their athletic endeavors.
Right, because it sounds like you have there's a bit of this dichotomy going on where you have some probably really active kids that are maybe doing multiple sports outside of school, but working with coaches or parents that might not have the background or knowledge to be able to establish an LTAD fitness-based program. Whereas there might be more information in the schools, and even that might be lacking. So what are some of the challenges of maybe kids that are doing too much, or kids that are doing the multi-sport athlete that are doing lots in school as well as lots in their extracurriculars?
Yeah, that's an awesome point to bring up because we always talk about the early sport specialization, right? Mike Boyle deems that as one of the devils, which it is a difficult thing for a kid to develop physically. But the other extreme can also be said where an athlete playing every sport and never having an off season is just as detrimental to their performance or to their physical capabilities and development throughout that timeline. So the negative consequences go to each extreme. And I do believe that there is an off season that needs to be needed. And that's where the strength conditioning professional comes into to fill the voids, to assist sport coaches in developing a model for them to be able to do it through practice in the off season, right? All teams have practice in the off season. If they had a handful of exercises that they could do with their kids that had minimal equipment involved and it benefited those kids, that's something, right? Burnout, anxiety, those things all come into this, play into this, extreme of playing too many sports and never having some downtime. And then on top of that too, like, having your academic background in high school and in junior high, academic stress comes and a snap of a finger, right? It hits those kids really abruptly, grade 9, grade 10. So it cultivate all that into a big pile on top of all this sport. There's a lot of stress going on.
What are some of the ramifications of some of this burnout in terms of athletes sticking with sport, athletes being involved for life, because that's part of the LTAD model? How does this this stress manifest itself long term? What are the consequences?
Yeah, well, eventually, it ties in with physical education too. From what I'm been informed with physical educators and in the school districts, and talking with them and saying, well, there's some, say 20% of the physical education class does not like what is included in the class. Okay, so we can safely assume that 20%, when they get out of school, are not going to be involved in anything physical at all, any type of do with physical activity, right? Not saying they didn't they didn't want to do it. It's they didn't enjoy it. So you can flip that to sport now and say, well, okay, well, we have these athletes that have been pushed and pushed and pushed for 3 or 4 years, and they will drop out of their sport immediately whenever they do reach an age where they can make their own decisions, become a little more independent, which again sets them up for a more unhealthier lifestyle, not being physically active.
So, how can, we're not generally in these settings. We're not in the schools currently. We're not, for the most part, as S&C coaches working with youth sport. What sort of practical guides can we give to parents, to educators, to help them develop these movement skills, these physical literacy skills, as well as just what we consider good coaching skills of regressions, lateralizations, progressions, as well as taking into account like kids' overall workload through the week.
Mm-hmm. That's big when we talk about that off air, about how that's, a bunch of different streams, but really quickly and easy things that a sport coach can implement are cutting down the frequency of practice throughout the whole year and making more deliberate practice. So as you know, being a football player yourself, whenever you play band and football, practices were 2 hours. Well, maybe instead of having 3 practices a week at 120 minutes, you can cut that into 3 practices at 90 or 60 minutes, right? Make it very deliberate, intensive, and then basically let the kid go and have that extra hour in the day. That adds up for them to get schoolwork done, adds them to, have family time, etc. Also on top of that is incorporating some movement patterns you see in the sport or out of the sport. For example, a tennis player, if they decided at the age of 15 they want to do some tumbling and rolling, right, that would benefit them whenever they do get into that scenario in their sport. But even previously, if you go back to 10 years old, 11 years old, that's literally the model. That's the LTD model to be able to build them up their physical capabilities and capacities. So I think adding all those fun things, like a lineman having catch and running routes and doing that stuff at a middle age, like with a bigger kid, that helps them succeed and help them build those physical capabilities as well that they may not get in their sport.
Nice. What about out of the sport? Like, what are some of these, patterns, these, daily things that people can be doing, movements that should be in a fundamental movement toolbox?
Mm-hmm. So just starting off very general, the upper body, push, pull, vertical, horizontal. So meaning the push up being horizontal, vertical, holding any type of weight and pressing it overhead, things like that. Lower bodies, bilateral, unilateral exercises. A split squat can be done anywhere, and it can be done with anything. A towel, we've seen that through the pandemic. People have become very resourceful with things around the home. On top of that, looking at the torso, so anti-rotation exercise, not letting them twist side to side. Being a youth, they're really sloppy, uncoordinated. Also, be able to create tension. So especially if they're in a collision sport or a contact sport, it's very important for them to be able to create stiffness. And then on top of that, all the stuff that S&C professionals would know with those group of kids would be the jumping, rebounding, deacceleration, acceleration, reacceleration, and then the throwing, catching, the grasping. Do all of that stuff, even if your sport really does demand it. And predominantly working with hockey players and being around hockey, they don't get those. It's such a unique sport where they don't get all those different types of movements and athletic abilities. So getting off the ice, having a game of catcher playing some soccer does them some justice in long term, and it gets their mind away from the sport.
So so you can build on that. I think that's a good point there. What are you doing with your youth hockey players that you're working with? If you work with athletes from other sports at the youth level, what kind of stuff are you doing that might not be quote unquote sport specific? Because a lot of parents, when they come to you, might be looking for sport specific work at a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing you do see a lot of. What our warm ups always consist of is like, we're outside, we're moving, we're doing things. So if it's a group of, U14 hockey players, we're having a soccer game, 15-minute soccer game. We're getting out of the gym. We're getting away from just doing dynamic stretches. We'll do a bit of activation when they come in, but prior to that, it's fun, engagement, right? So then if you're looking at flipping it to rugby, for example, maybe we'll have a ball hockey. So we set up some sticks, do some things, and incorporate different sports into that warm up, and then trying to persuade the parent and educate the parent to say this is helping your child more long term. It may not be what you see on social media, but it is improving your athlete for long term success.
Nice, as well as not lead them down the path to overuse and overtraining and burnout,
Exactly.
which
Yep.
takes them away from sport and robs them of long-term physical activity.
And that was one thing too, Elliot. Sorry to cut you off, but that was some things that parents, they always look to the future for their child. Everywhere's out of, and I'm not a parent. I'm speaking just for a couple parents that I've interacted with, and for sure, tell me if I'm wrong. But I do believe that parents always want the best for their children later in the future, but they never think about, if a child was playing hockey, well, maybe I should let them incorporate some more things into it and let them have some fun into it. They may be very passionate parent and they want that kid to be successful in that sport, but kind of letting the child or the youth figure it out themselves is something that has been pretty rare. And when it does happen, it's exciting to see the person grow, the youth grow into an adult when they turn 17, 18, 19.
Nice. And then what about in terms of, educators? What are some things that we can bring to the schools in terms of just, basic principles and concepts? Like, do we want to be, running kids, long duration stuff, short rest? Like, what types of intervals do we want? Focus on good quality work at high intensity with longer rests. What types of movements do we want to be engaging in? What are some tips for educators, people in schools that they could be putting into practice right now?
For that, well, if we look at the middle-aged kids, nothing truly steady state right now. They can't thermoregulate. They can't even sweat. So the poor kids are burning up inside. So having high intensity, little short intervals for that if they are playing. And then also if they're in that middle-aged group category, is incorporating basic movement patterns or incorporating some resistance training does not hurt them. That's one of the myths that people may see, is that it stunts growth or it causes injuries in children. No, it doesn't, but done improperly does increase the risk of injury. But making sure that everything that we've talked about in those movements, just progressively loading them very slowly, slow cooker mentality, really has benefit later on when they do become the high school and they are strong enough and they can handle that steady state and all those other physical capabilities that they'll need to have, such as power, etc.
Yeah. So even things like jumping and running, ways to progress that is, because jumping people don't consider a high intensity thing, but it is pretty high intense.
Yeah.
But starting with less jumps and lower jumps, and eventually progressing to multi-directional jumps over time. And when it comes to sprints, like understanding that the longer the sprint is, the more intense it is, and the more rest that the longer you're going is. So understanding those things as well too, and understanding, I think, looking at, sounds like as well too, like understand how to progress and regress kids as well, so that if you are doing sprints, depending on, as you as an educator, how you perceive your group of fitness level. Well, everyone can do a sprint, but maybe they're doing different distances. Because that way, if you're focusing on deceleration work, kids with lower fitness level, lower deceleration capabilities have longer, it's a little bit easier for them to stop and slow down. And then you can just adjust. The sprints of the distances over time as well too. So absolutely. I think that's one thing that gets caught up or gets missed at the school level, is that we just don't know how to scale things. Understand, okay, well, we're all going to run 50 meters. Well, we don't maybe need to. Like, there should maybe be 10, 20, 30 meters. And maybe over the course of 8 weeks, if you're doing speed work, you're slowly getting longer. And there's still going to be some kids that are going to be running shorter distances. Like, I remember Owen, like working with you guys, like, we would all do sprints, but the linemen are going to run shorter distances for acceleration than some of our outside the box players, right? So
Yep.
And finding different ways to be able to do that, and again, like you said, make it fun. So there's a lot of content out there on the internet, but if people, other youth sport coaches or educators, are looking for some reliable content, who would be some of the names they should be looking out for?
previously mentioned, Jeremy First, that's Achieve Performance. He's got a resource on his website. It's amazing, and hopefully we can post that in the notes for people to go investigate and look for themselves. He's great at incorporating that environment and facilitating creativity. The other one would be Mike Boyle, so Body by Boyle. He is more of a resistance training. They're getting into the athletic essentials part, where Jeremy's is more of, it's open. It's an open concept for those really, really, really young athletes. And then Elizabeth Wohlers, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. She is putting great content out on Twitter of Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting with youth athletes and teaching those mechanics right off the hop. And she's got amazing progressions and regressions for every type of skill level for those two types of exercise.
It sounds like you have the whole spectrum there, all the way from, more like what might look like a gym class. So if you're a teacher in the school setting, you're looking for stuff. Hey, how can I safely implement movement literacy in my school class? Maybe I look at someone at Jeremy Fish, and if maybe kids are getting into middle school, high school, and starting to dabble in resistance training, and you want some of the principles, maybe something a bit more like Coach Boyle, someone to look at, and and then if you're looking maybe a bit more specific or advanced, and someone like Elizabeth could be that person that you look out and reach out and see what they're doing.
Exactly, and it seems like around in Prince Edward Island anyway, that powerlifting in high schools and middle schools has become very popular. So again, if there's any Prince Edward Island parents that are watching this or are able to get a hold of this, if that would be one lady to very check out.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Owen. Appreciate you giving your time and knowledge and research and wisdom. There's a couple references that I know you have that we'll be sure to post in the description here, just so that everyone has access to that and be able to dive a little bit deeper if they're looking at it. But there's a lot of good info in here, and it sounds like there's an opportunity for us as S&C coaches to be able to support parents, youth sport coaches, but also teachers in high school. So they're really they're the people that are spending the most amount of time with kids in their young careers, and it's where the most amount of kids are playing sport and engaged in physical activity. So if we can get some of the key things I know we've all gone to school for, and all the things that we've practiced in the weight room and on the field in terms of organizing regressions, I think there's a lot of benefit we can do for kids out there. So appreciate you leading this story, and hope to talk to you again soon.
You too. Thank you, Elliot, for your time.